from the EWTN television studios in Irondale, Alabama. This is EWTN Theology Roundtable. Voting for Life.
Hello, I'm Doug Keck, and welcome to this special edition of EWTN Theology Roundtable, Voting for Life, a special topic that deserves a special and important panel. So joining us on this panel, beaming in from his universe, is the one and only Father Robert Spitzer, of course, from Father Spitzer's universe. We have Father Mitch Pacwa, the host of Scripture and Tradition, of course, EWTN Live, a mainstay here for many, many years of EWTN, and our Vice President of Theology, Colin Donovan, usually the host of this program, but has moved over into the expert seat so we can have a program of this quality with the kind of people who need to answer the questions that so many of us hear throughout the year, especially as we move towards a very, very important election. One of the topics we hear about right away to the panel, and I'll go first to Father Spitzer on this, is the idea of forming a Catholic conscience. And there seems to be a lot of people have different opinions of what that means. Could you tell us, is there such a thing as a Catholic conscience, and how does one form one?
Absolutely, Doug. There is a Catholic conscience, and the magisterium has been at the forefront of helping us to form a Catholic conscience. Conscience is not just a series of feelings, like feelings of guilt when I'm about to do something wrong, or nobility when I'm about to do something right, though certainly conscience includes those feelings. But really, conscience also has some general principles attached to it, like, don't kill an innocent person, don't lie so as to harm your neighbor, et cetera, et cetera. So it's got some very general principles, but unfortunately, as St. Thomas Aquinas teaches us, conscience doesn't have a lot of specific principles. And so we want to form our conscience on the basis of Jesus and the interpretation of Jesus's words that are given by the successor of St. Peter, the office that Jesus started to have supreme juridical and magisterial teaching authority, in perpetuity till the end of time. And that's how he would protect us from the gates of hell. So essentially, we need to form our conscience on the basis of church teaching. And so a Catholic conscience would be one that has studied church teaching, takes it seriously, intends to follow it, so that that person can follow Christ, Jesus Christ, and then in the same sense, then do it according to a sense of goodness, and to act according to a sense of goodness and aversion to evil that Jesus intended as interpreted through the teaching of his church.
Father Pacwa, follow up your perspective.
It's absolutely necessary to see that conscience is also a function of reason. And a very important component of that Catholic tradition is to use our ability to think on the basis of principles, looking at principles that are even outside of Scripture and church teaching, but are consistent with it. For instance, looking at the cardinal virtues, such as justice and prudence and temperance, that these key virtues have principles within them, not feelings, so that justice is about what is due to each person. And then even prior to that, conscience builds upon an understanding of what it means to be a human being. You have reason, and that this belongs to all human beings in varying degrees of ability, but still reason is part of it, and free will that flows out of that reason, that you can't impede somebody's right to know the truth, which is what reason is completely oriented towards, and their ability to make a freely chosen decision based on truth. This is also an inherent part, so that then you recognize that dignity in every human being, and you apply the principles of right and wrong to everybody equally with the appropriateness of their activity. This is very, very important because we see a tendency today to say, well, some groups have had more oppression or problems, so we have to let them slide on issues of justice.
Almost like an affirmative action kind of a thing.
Exactly.
In some way. Okay.
That's not justice. And this is something that we have to bring into play. And then finally, as Catholics, we also keep in mind the principle of mercy that is there with those principles. We start with those, but we don't exclude mercy, but we also learn how to apply it.
Now, Colin, as our VP of Theology, you put together or worked on the Voter's Guide, which people can go to, and want people to go to our website and see that, and putting that together. And a lot of what we're talking about is really based on what's on that particular website. So why don't you follow up on your aspect of forming a Catholic conscience?
Yeah, I think the point Father Spitzer has made, and I think Father Mitch as well, is about the general nature of these matters, but the church does get very specific in its teaching. And it's interesting to know how this has been sort of muddled in the last 50 years. A lot of people jump off on the matter of conscience from the Second Vatican Council. And the council had a very specific pastoral point to make about respecting others. We don't call separated brethren heretics or schismatics or what like that, but we take them as they are and where they're at. But that doesn't mean that Catholics don't have a specific way of forming their conscience and specific norms by which they should form them. And so what are those norms? And the common theology of the church, both dogmatic and moral, is that in addition to those things which are revealed in sacred scripture and tradition and affirmed by the magisterium as such, there are many other things. For instance, much of the moral law has not been positively affirmed, but rather taken for granted as part of the ordinary magisterium of the church. So Cardinal Ratzinger, in speaking of these matters back in the 90s, talked about this element that these are part of the faith, because not only is our faith in God and our faith in Christ our faith in the church, but then the promises made to Christ that the church can interpret these things, and even the natural law, as the popes have affirmed, so that we have some concrete ideas. Now, we had a complaint the other day. Somebody wrote us and said, well, why are you teaching theologians? Well, the reason is so much is not defined and spoken directly of, or spoken only indirectly of by the papal magisterium. It's the moral theological tradition which affirms most of these, you might call them lesser points. Why are certain things good? Why are certain things evil? And that's really at the crux of the issues today and the division even among Catholics. Because with the wrong idea of conscience, people gravitated to theories such as proportionalism and consequentialism, which say that it's not about evil objects which you avoid doing, but you're weighing up the goods and the bads of the circumstances, and you're choosing the better and the one that produces the most good fruit. And that's sufficient. And that's been condemned by John Paul II in Veritatis Splendor. So there's some very specific guidance that's in the guide on those matters.
Now, Father Spitzer, to follow up with that and to play off of what that confusion that sometimes, as you indicated, somebody would ask a question like that, you end up with the idea, and sometimes you hear Newman quoted about the conscience is supreme, and then people's idea of a conscience tends to be, in a colloquial sense, like, well, if I listen to multiple people and I listen to the church and then I feel comfortable with my decision, well, that means I have a clear conscience, in which case it's properly formed. What's wrong with that idea?
Well, feelings are deceiving, and that's the first problem. And one person put it so bluntly, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And so the first thing we want to do is not just have good feelings, we want certainty. And the best way of getting certainty is to go right back to what the church's teaching is. The church's teaching is fundamentally, as Father Pacwa just pointed out, fundamentally grounded in reason. And so we can, say that we're not just getting an answer prepared for us by the church, set out as a matter of authority and given to us. There's always a reasonable explanation given. But our objective, our responsibility is to, first of all, know what the church is teaching, and then to know what might be called the propter quid, the reason why the church teaches what it teaches. Because invariably it will be reasonable, and it is reasonable. And as we look at the issues of today, especially the issue of life, there's nothing more reasonable out there than the church's teaching. And frankly, a lot of what goes against the church's teaching is utter sophistry. And so I guess what I'd follow up with is to say, yes, Colin is absolutely correct in this. And what we need to do right now is to take a look at the breadth, the depth of that reasonable tradition. It is spoken with authority, but it's for our own good, so that we won't commit an error, not only that would jeopardize our salvation, but jeopardize other people's salvation, and in the same process to jeopardize justice, to jeopardize the common good, and to jeopardize, frankly, the society and the culture in which we live. So following church teaching is really, really important.
And that's why we have the voter's guide, and people can go to, put up on the screen,
Exactly.
where you can go to EWTN.com/vote, and you can get all the information, kind of follow along even with what we're talking about. Let me ask you, Father Mitch, there seems to still be confusion in people's minds. You would think it's pretty straightforward, listening to what each of you has said so far. But out in the culture, even in the church in some ways, there seems to be some misunderstanding. Is that always by accident, or are there other people at times who have different opinions and feel like playing with conscience is a way to get there?
It's not just that they have feelings. Sometimes their feelings come into play, but also a lot of people bring in other factors that are more centered on their ego. For instance, they are concerned about their economic concerns. And so I might have to compromise some of my Catholic morals to make sure I succeed in business. If that means I might have to pass a bribe on to a local politician or more, I mean, you got to do business, right? Or you take lots of other issues that come up where selfish concerns, including, well, if I go with the Catholic side, I cannot make any advances among my political associates. There's no, we see, that right now the Democratic Party has said that pro-life candidates ought not to apply for their party, because somebody might say, but I hold so many of their other ideas. I just got to compromise what I think about abortion or contraception. And that I just got to do that to make it, because these other values are so important to me. There's that going on as well. And we can take a look at those are examples of wide-ranging issues that impinge on people's decision-making and put their concerns for success in economics or other areas, politics, ahead of the life of the unborn and other people.
Right. Well, speaking of that, and we're going to move into also, as we move ahead, non-negotiable and negotiable moral issues. But let me ask you also the idea of invincible ignorance, that there's people out there on the faith, Catholics, even good Catholics, who try to live out their faith on a regular basis, go to Mass, and to some degree they just don't understand what the issues are, or they're not presented to them. And that's a question a lot of times Catholics who watch EWTN say, I watch you and I hear it, and I hear it pretty straightforward, but I don't necessarily hear it the same way in my local parish.
Sure, and it's part of something we talked about the Vatican Council earlier, that we know that people are in different places and they come to accept the truth. It's simply telling people what is true or not true is not the end of overcoming their invincible ignorance. There are many factors there. But certainly if you're not looking for the truth, then there's a real problem there. If you're only satisfied with your opinion or the opinion you have from your circle of friends or those circle of theologians that you read regularly or whatever it is, and you're simply not interested, what has the papal tradition said? What has the councils and the fathers said? If you're not interested, then you're obviously avoiding the truth, and that ignorance is vincible. So people have to be careful that they're sincere in wanting to know the truth and not fooling themselves, because now they're culpable before God for sort of, Oh, don't tell me that truth. I don't want to know it.
Well, let me ask you, Father Spitzer, on that point, and a follow-up on that is the idea that sometimes I think some of us lose sight of the fact that regardless of how we convince ourselves of these things, God knows the truth, and we're going to have to face him one day with that truth. And is part of the problem that people don't think there is a truth anymore?
Yeah, I think that is a huge problem, and we grow up, and Pope Benedict put it, in a very relativistic culture, and that is reinforced daily in the social media and sometimes in the traditional media as well, and relativism reigns supreme. More than that, I think a lot of people have learned in college, or seemingly learned, that the truth is not only relative, but it cannot be known under any circumstances. And finally, of course, you have what Socrates battled 2,400 years ago, namely the sophist adage that truth not only is relative, but truth can be manipulated to what you want it to be for your own particular political or for that social political ambitions. So we've got a huge problem. I mean, I think sophistry is really out there full range, and sophistry just basically holds, look, there are just a whole lot of opinions. Nobody can possibly sort them out, and because nobody can sort them out, you're blameless for not doing it. Who are you to try and sort it all out? Well, you're not blameless for not sorting it out. We do have a source that does sort it out, and our source is the church. Our source is the Holy Father in concert with the bishops. Our source in the United States is our National Conference of Catholic Bishops, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. We do have a source that is really very important and definitive for sorting it out. So we just can't duck behind the fact that, well, we never bothered to look at what the bishop said. We never bothered to look at what the church in her official doctrines said. We really do have the responsibility of knowing it because, as you put it, Doug, one day we will have to face the Lord, and we just can't use that old dodge of saying, well, there's just so much out there. Who can sort out? Not me. I'm just the hoi polloi. What do I know? But we do know the source we can go to, and we ought to make every effort to follow it. And if we can't understand the rationale that's given by the bishops, and they do give a reasonable rationale for that, then we have to trust them that they are, in some sense, the followers of the apostles, that they've inherited their office, and that we should listen to what they collectively are saying in our country, and we ought to collectively listen to our Holy Father, to the church itself, her church documents, in trying to make our decisions. So, I don't think that dodge really works. We do have a source, and we do have a clear source, and we can find out. Anybody can go to Google and take a look at what the church says on these things.
Well, in the world we live in today, Father Mitch, and you can follow up directly, I was going to ask you just the idea of peer pressure on people. And the fact that we see out there the idea, Father Mitch, that people are afraid to stand up and say what they are. When I worked on the Playboy Channel years ago, heaven forbid, we used to say a lot of people watched it but never admitted to it. Now, I think that's the case with EWTN. A lot of people, I think, watch EWTN. I think they care about their faith, but they're afraid to admit it many times in public because of the culture we're in. Isn't that having an impact on people forming a proper conscience and living it out?
Absolutely. There's a couple factors. One of them is that if you speak for positions contrary to what is acceptable in certain media and other circles, it's not just that they disagree with you, but there is a culture to shut down other opinions. That this freedom of speech is much at risk today, as is the right to bear arms. And that
you see that ties into religious liberty as well, right?
Well, that's the right to speech is itself based on the prior part in the First Amendment. The first right that is mentioned is freedom of religion, in that Congress shall not establish nor prevent the practice of any religion. That makes possible freedom of speech, which is next, followed by freedom of assembly and freedom of the press. And the reason is freedom of religion has to do with the interior decision to know, to think, and to choose. And then the freedom of speech can express that. All of that is very much at stake in these times. And so it's not just that social pressure is, it's not nice to talk about religion and politics. Now it is stamped down on, and I don't like to go this far, but it is hard not to see this as similar to the clampdowns on freedom of expression back in Soviet Union or in Nazi Germany, two socialist governments that could not tolerate other opinions.
Right.
And
Stifling the church was one of the first things you did.
And stifling the church by first establishing freedom of worship, but taking away freedom of religion, so that you can keep your church open and do your prayers in church, but it has no place in the public forum. Right. That's when, as a matter of fact, when President Obama had brought up freedom of worship.
Right.
This is not our value. Our value is freedom of religion, which can be expressed in the public forum.
And that's where people don't get the distinction. I know you make sure you point that out all the time, and that's important. Let me ask you about that whole point in wrapping this part up. What about the separation of church and state? We hear that all the time, and somebody wrote a letter to Father Spitzer's University and said, I don't vote on my religion, I vote on the issues. In a sense, this idea of the church should not be telling me how to vote.
One of the reasons, Father Mitch mentioned the historical circumstances. Most of our ancestors came over here to get away from religious persecution specifically, whether it was the established churches in the British Isles, the Church of Ireland, the Church of England, or even from the Catholic powers in Europe that oppressed those freedoms as well. And they came over here for that freedom. It's why it's the first right of the... And so it was a feature of the thinkers who produced the Constitution and the Declaration of Liberty, with all the faults of how the country has applied it ever since, that you could not build a just or peaceful or free society on anything other than a moral and religious people, as John Adams described it. And without a moral and religious people, those who are beholden to an authority outside of themselves, today we're not beholden to authority outside of ourselves. We're beholden to earthly authority, to earthly experts who want us to do certain things. So that the persecution which Father Mitch mentioned in the culture, it sort of makes the Puritans look very libertine in their ideas by comparison. Because short of burning people at the stake, they vilify them, they destroy careers and lives and so on. And so we're very much there. And another period that's interesting, and I won't elaborate on it, is Germany in the middle of the 1800s with Bismarck and the German theologians, the development of liberal theology. The Pope had to write twice to the German bishops to talk about these ideas. One, the importance of education, because from that the governmental leaders without morals will come if it's bad. And the other one is the issue of the teaching, that to follow, as we've all said, the teaching of the tradition on all of these matters. That's the safeguard. That's where you get the certainty of conscience that Father Spitzer talked about.
Father Mitch?
I was going to say, it's very important, especially for those of us who live in Alabama, to remember that separation of church and state is not in the Constitution. This was a principle stated in a letter by Thomas Jefferson, who, by the way, was not present at the writing of the Constitution. He was, at the time, our ambassador to France. But he wrote a letter when Baptists in Connecticut were prohibited from building a church by the Congregationalists who ran Connecticut. That line was taken in a court decision in 1947 and then a second one, I believe, in 1948 by Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black of Alabama, a man who got to the Senate riding on the wave of the Ku Klux Klan, was a member of the Klan, and who wrote the law in Oregon prohibiting Catholic schools from being permitted back in 1922. And this is the gentleman who hated the church, and to prevent the Catholic kids from riding school buses in New Jersey and getting textbooks, he came up with that principle from Thomas Jefferson's letter, put it into a court decision, 2 court decisions, where he wrote the majority, that there's a wall of separation between church and state. Once he got that into the Supreme Court background, the precedent, then it was used again in 62 to prohibit prayer and scripture, then in 82 to prohibit even the presence of the 10 Commandments in schools. But that's not in the Constitution. Right. And this is not a basic value of our nation. And while we don't want established religion, we don't want the church to run the government. Right. Either way, still, we have to watch the use of this so that it then becomes an absolute separation by which my religion makes no effect. When that happens, then, as Colin said, we have a major problem.
Back here with Father Robert Spitzer, ensconced in California, Father Mitch Pacwa, of course, and our VP of Theology, Colin Donovan. Let's move on to the next topic with you, Father Spitzer, non-negotiable versus negotiable moral issues. And there does seem to be the idea that there are certain things that you can kind of deal with and others that really are pretty black and white. Could you tell us what would fall under non-negotiable for a Catholic when thinking in terms of voting for someone?
Yeah, for non-negotiables, just think of 3 criteria. The first is whether something is an intrinsic evil or not, malum in se, that it is evil in itself or not. And there are ways we can determine that reasonably. There are ways that we determine it through the teaching of Jesus, that the church has done very well for us. The church has done a reasonable job. So that's the first thing we want to look at. Is something an intrinsic evil? If something is not an intrinsic evil, then of course there may be negotiability in some sense to it, depending on certain circumstances or whatever the case may be. The second thing to look at is whether something is a matter of what we might call ordinary or extraordinary magisterium, that is to say a declaration by the church that of virtual infallibility or infallibility versus one that is a matter of prudential judgment. In other words, where somebody is making a judgment about the application of a principle rather than of a principle itself. So that's a second criteria we want to look at. The third criterion we want to look at is a rational criterion, and that rational criterion has to do with the hierarchy of values, if I can put it that way. So, for example, if something is a matter of what we might call the most fundamental moral principles, then that would be a highest value and very likely to be a non-negotiable. For example, the principle of non-maleficence, which is just a big way of saying the principle of avoiding unnecessary evil. So what's the highest way you can violate that principle? That you could do an unnecessary harm or evil to somebody else. Well, it's obviously to take their life. And so the highest violation of any moral principle, which would take precedence over anything else, would be the violation of killing an innocent human being. So unnecessarily killing an innocent human being. Now, of course, if you just take those 3 principles and you look at it, intrinsic evil, definitely killing an innocent, unnecessarily killing an innocent human being is an intrinsic evil. We can discern that rationally. It's been told to us again and again by the Catholic Church in multiple documents. You can be sure this is a bad one, it's intrinsic evil, it's a non-negotiable. The second area is this a matter of extraordinary and ordinary magisterium? Multiple times a matter of extraordinary magisterium, and therefore this is not a matter of prudential judgment where the faithful could respectfully disagree with an interpretation of the application of a principle. And thirdly, with respect to the hierarchy of rights, I mean, let's face it, abortion, I mean, that is the unnecessary killing of an innocent person. There's nothing more serious than that. For all intents and purposes, you can't compromise. You can't say some other principle would invalidate it. You can't say that another principle would compromise it. You can't say that there are other issues that you could sum up all the issues, and say, well, I've got, some reason for militating against this highest of possible rights. I mean, it's a non-negotiable. I mean, imagine if you said, well, I really liked everything that the Nazi regime was doing because they were getting us a whole bunch of employment we didn't have before, getting the country back in order. It was virtually chaotic. They're finally getting the inflation factors under control. I mean, at long last, we have we have to put up with a little genocide here, but, if you weigh it out according to all these other issues, of course you would say, wait a minute, genocide? I mean, you can't violate that principle. It's a non-negotiable. I don't care what else the Nazis are doing for you. You got to stop that. So now we've got a new Holocaust. We've got the Holocaust of unnecessary Holocaust of innocent human beings. For what reason? For seemingly the reason of convenience that has been put euphemistically under a variety of other things like the gender rights and so forth and so on. Now, the main thing, of course, is this a non-negotiable? It's an absolute non-negotiable. Is it of the highest moral magnitude? Yes, it is of the highest moral magnitude. Has it been declared by extraordinary magisterium clearly? Yes, it's been declared by extraordinary magisterium very clearly. I mean, what in the world? I mean, there's no, that is a non-negotiable of the first rung, and so I'll just, right. Rather than be a time hog here, I'll just sum up by saying you cannot get a more non-negotiable principle than the prohibition of abortion. It's an intrinsic evil, highest moral magnitude, extraordinary magisterium. It's everything you'd ever want in a non-negotiable.
Very good. Father Mitch, let me ask you then why do we hear things sometimes when people write, they say, well, I agree, abortions, but it says it's not the only thing that I should consider when I'm voting, which lends some people to think, oh, well, I can weigh things off against this non-negotiable.
Mm-hmm. It's not the only thing, but in these values, it's the highest thing. It outweighs a lot of the other issues. The right, the claim to have a right to health care, that's a very important issue. It should be discussed. But if you're dead, you don't get any health care. So you have to look at abortion. And here's something that I hear often. Well, what about the case of a rape? It's not fair to a woman. And that is absolutely right. It is not fair to a woman. Being raped is, to call it unfair, is mild.
It's horrible. Obviously.
It's that is another non-negotiable value. Rape of anybody is a non-negotiable. But then you have to say, when you apply it to the issue of abortion, I often put it this way. If you caught the rapist, would you take a chainsaw, cut off his arms, cut off his legs, and then smash his skull? And the answer is no. The Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. On principle, we cannot do that. So then we have to say, if you won't do it to the guilty perpetrator of the horrible crime of rape, why do you want to do it to an innocent child who is also a victim of that rape? This is where we have to think through these values and see that the value of the woman's right to determine her life cannot supersede the right of life for the child in her womb. That's a higher value. And these are the things that we have to keep in mind. Yes, we keep in mind her needs, but we have to subordinate certain issues to the higher issue of life.
Also, Colin, another issue that you hear a lot about, especially today, is immigration and immigration policy, and even the whole idea of the welcoming the stranger, the Good Samaritan. Obviously, our present Holy Father has spoken about this kind of thing with migration, and people see that as a very, very important issue. How does that, is that a non-negotiable, or what is it?
Well, the thing is, it participates in non-negotiables. Obviously, is how we to treat other people. But in a very clear address which Pope Benedict gave to the European Parliament, he sets out what the non-negotiables are as a concrete norm. He says that they have to do with the life and the dignity of life. It has to do with the family, and that would, of course, include the sexual issues, the gender ideology, and many other things. It would include something like a case of rape. The other thing would be, the third thing is the right of the parents to raise their children. Now, that's from a particularly Catholic perspective, but it's also from the natural law perspective, and it encompasses the freedom of conscience and rights of conscience altogether. But within that, you can also then distinguish strata, because obviously, as both of our fathers have said, to take the life of the person, that's a direct thing. If I kill you, you're dead. Now, providing good health care, if you die from health care, bad health care, there's no single cause, and there's unlikely to be morally a direct cause unless the doctor or the nurse is going around and euthanizing people. There's a lot of failures there, maybe failures of you going to the doctor in a timely fashion, or failure of the doctor acting timely, or of the therapy, it's experimental. There can be all kinds of reasons that your health care fails you. It's not an immediate and direct cause of killing, and therefore, yes, the protecting the life and providing the health care is important, but the taking of a life directly and immediately is an intrinsic evil. And there's where the church makes the difference in strata. So the immigrant who has a certain rights, for instance, the church talks about the right of migration, but also the right of the country to have a controlled and organized migration. It talks about those things. And the treatment of the migrants has to do with protecting their dignity. But the violation of that dignity does not equal the taking of a life. So you, in proportion, and this is that proportionalism or consequentialism I talked about, the proportion there between health care and abortion, you know, if you're weighing them, it's like this.
Right.
Abortion's grave, health care can be grave, but usually by virtue of multiple failures of people to do the right thing at the right time.
Now, Father Mitch, you kind of alluded to this, the idea it's wrongly argued that a basket of negotiable goods is proportionate to a non-negotiable good. Mm-hmm. Explain how many people do that.
There are plenty of examples throughout history where people, let's go back to a topic that I find nowadays everybody's pretty much on board with already, but at one time we're not. Namely, the question of slavery, where, look, the economy depends on slaves doing work in these fields and ginning the cotton and the other work around the fields. Without them doing that, our economy would have collapsed, we would go hungry, and then they would be hungry as well, and everybody would be worse off. This kind of thought then was also given further justification by saying, well, they're kind of inferior people anyway. They're from Africa, after all. And so that was part of taking a look at, and this was stated in some of the law and court decisions, that bringing Africans over here was a step toward improving them, and slavery is just one step along the way. Well, all of that is absurd. It's absurd because, like the right to life, which is a fundamental value, human freedom is a fundamental value. The ability of Africans to think and choose their own life, whether they would come to America or not, must be given to them. This is where the church recognized, way before Columbus, that human nature includes recognition of the right of self-determination within God's law, of course. But this is belonged, and that was taken away. But people said, "But think of what's going to happen to us."
Right.
That would be an example. Now we can all look back and see, yes, that was a wrong way to think. But now we have to look at our own situation.
Right.
And the kind of reason where we say, well, there might be too many people.
Right.
There, or other values that we bring in.
And sometimes that rolls into environmentalism in some people's minds
Exactly.
too. Right.
Humans are stated to be, by some circles, the biggest cause of pollution there is, and therefore eliminate some of them.
Right.
Someone besides me.
Right. Well, let me move on to another topic that we hear a lot about, which is the seamless garment or the consistent life ethic and what that means. And we have a clip here because there's a lot of confusion, I think we all agree, on exactly what Cardinal Bernardin meant when he said that, because it seemed like a lot of people have used that to try to say, well, abortion's important, but all of these other things that we've talked about, they're all connected, which they are, but connected in a sense of importance. So we have a clip here from an interview with a woman who actually worked for Cardinal Bernardin, who explains exactly what he meant by that.
What strikes me in this larger effort of trying to cast AOC as the future of the church is an attempt to blur pro-life issues, mainly abortion and euthanasia for political purposes. Is that what's happening here? Trying to trade off other issues where you might have some connection with Catholic social teaching to disrupt and dislocate these issues that sit at the very top of the moral hierarchy. Is that what we're seeing here?
I think so. I mean, we've seen this for some time, right? The absolute abuse of Cardinal Joseph Bernardin's consistent ethic of life. I worked for Cardinal Bernardin as his pro-life spokesperson for many years. He was quoted on more than one occasion of saying, if anyone is trying to use the consistent ethic to say that we don't hold people's feet to the fire over abortion, they are misusing the ethic, and I abhor when people do that. So he was quite firm that no, the issues are not all equal. They are linked, but they are not all equal. And we even see in Evangelium Vitae, the Holy Father addressed issues, along a consistent ethic life spectrum. But the left kind of seized on that, really attempted to misinterpret it, and they use it as sort of like a checklist. Well, if I'm against the death penalty and, I'm for migrant rights, that somehow means it gives me a pass on abortion. And Cardinal Bernardin himself said, you absolutely get no pass on abortion because there are some issues that are simply fundamental. I paraphrase John Paul II. He said this in Crossing the Threshold of Hope. Your other rights don't mean a whole lot if you're not alive to enjoy any of them.
Right. I think he might have been paraphrasing Father Mitch there from earlier in the program. But there you have it. So Father Spitzer, I mean, we hear that a lot out there, where people talk about that consistent life ethic, and we talked about the hierarchy of truth and how that can be misused. And have you seen that happen?
Oh yes, it's pretty constant within the culture today, and I would say that we have to come back and say, well, yes, there is an interlinking of issues, but that does not mean that there is an equal weighting of issues. So yes, there's linking, But there's all the issues are linked together. Life issues are linked to liberty issues. Liberty issues are linked to property issues and the right to have property, et cetera, et cetera. All these things are linked together. But there's not an equal weighting of issues. The church has never said that. Reason has never said that. Our founding fathers have never said that. Indeed, all those who have devised and developed the idea of inalienable rights, that starts with a good Jesuit, Father Francisco Suarez, in 1612 in his great work De Legibus. And then from there, it goes to Hugo Grotius. Hugo Grotius gives it to John Locke. John Locke gives it to Thomas Jefferson. What did every single one of those philosophers say? They weren't just saying this because the church had taught it. They were saying it because the right to life is more fundamental than the right to liberty. In other words, the right to life is the condition necessary for the very possibility of the right to liberty. If I kill you, your liberty rights are a moot question. And that was the same thing in the Dred Scott decision, another violation of the intrinsic levels of rights. And there it was decided by the Supreme Court unanimously that the white man's right to property, to own the slaves, superseded the black man's right to liberty. But it's precisely the opposite if you look at this from the vantage point of logic. The right to liberty is absolutely necessary for the right to property. After all, I can say, oh, Doug, you get to own all the property you want. Right. I just get to own you. De facto, I get to own all your property too. So of course, your property rights become a moot question by the very fact that I own you. So the intrinsic weighting of these rights, this is a matter of reason. It's a matter of logic. It's a matter of rational philosophy from age to age. Yes, the church has taught this clearly, no doubt about it, but also reason has taught it clearly, and it certainly has acceded to the rational conscience of philosophers, including our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, etc., very much so throughout the centuries.
Father Mitch?
I was going to add too, since you brought up Dred Scott, I think it's important to remember that the consistent teaching of the church had been against slavery. It was an automatic excommunication. And it was excommunication because the papal teaching recognized the inherent humanity of African and all other human beings, that they had reason and free will, therefore they cannot be enslaved. And they frequently quoted St. John Chrysostom, "Who are you to enslave whom Christ has set free from sin by his death on the cross?" Right. That was consistent with them. But we see that even when in 1839 Pope Gregory XVI issued yet another bull condemning slavery, the American bishops stayed silent. And in fact, even more to the shame that I feel as a Jesuit, the president of Georgetown and other Jesuits owned slaves and sold them in order to keep Georgetown going, split up families. It's become quite public. Roger Taney, the Supreme Court Justice who wrote Dred Scott, did not bring his Catholic teaching to bear, either on the fact that he owned slaves, contrary to church teaching, and he promoted slavery, he promoted the Confederacy separating, even though he was a Supreme Court Justice, and he denied the humanity of slaves. The lack of Catholic teaching by bishops and priests influenced that.
It's really a foreshadowing of so much of what we see really today.
It's parallel.
Exactly.
Parallel to abortion.
Let me ask you about the charge we get all the time. You can't be a one-issue voter. See, you're tied up in this abortion thing, and you're just a one-issue voter. What's your response to that?
My response is, I had a dream, and in this dream, political parties that favor choice but are for all the other issues won overwhelming control of the government, and they suddenly were enlightened and they embraced the life of the unborn, and they ended abortion. And I asked myself on waking, was that a nightmare or was that possible? It's not possible. A consistent ethic of life is not going to occur because the party that is wrong on so many other issues suddenly gets the light and embraces the entirety of the moral law. But that the party which is trying to live that moral law and has many defects in doing it is infused with Catholic and evangelical values and then transforms the entirety of what it does. That is a reasonable dream. The other is not only a nightmare because it's never going to happen, but there are a lot of other negatives that would come about with regard to freedom and marriage and family in that instance.
And we're just about out of time, but it does roll into the idea, it does seem a little more normal for the average person to believe that if you already believe in life, maybe you can work on those other issues. But if you're dealing with a party or a platform that's saying it's anti-life and wants basically abortion through all 9 months into infanticide, how are you going to convince those people to change that when it seems to be central or the third rail in that particular party? We're just about out of time. You got a minute to say something, Father Spitzer, to our audience that you want them to take away from this show.
Oh, well, I would say, first of all, you do have to consider all the issues that we talked about today, that abortion is a non-negotiable issue on every level, that there is not an equal weighting of moral issues either in the Catholic Church or according to any rational criterion whatsoever, that the right to life is always the most important, the most fundamental moral value, as well as the most fundamental right, according to our founding fathers, all the way down to the present. This cannot be, negotiated. The third thing that I would say is that the misinterpretations of the seamless garment, the idea that we could just take a whole bunch of other issues and say, see, I've got 8 other issues, for this candidate, and I only have just this one non-negotiable issue for this candidate. I guess I'll vote for the one that has the 8 issues. It doesn't work like that. The church doesn't teach that it works like that. If you read the bishop's, voting pamphlet very carefully, EWTN's voting pamphlet very carefully, you'll see that it doesn't work like that. We have to vote first and foremost for the non-negotiable, against the intrinsic evil. Pro-life must be what we do.
Father Mitch.
I just would say that we also have to keep in mind other essential issues like marriage. The abortion flows from a lack of concept of family and marriage, and this is a major problem in our family, in our culture. Let's also work to build that up. Where do we find pro-family folks? This is going to be also key.
And that's under attack as well, as we know.
Very much.
And it also involves the religious freedom, because in defending abortion, they've coerced the idea of law and even of the First Amendment to think that, well, keep it private, as you said, that we have a freedom of worshiping, but not a freedom of exercising the religion in the public square. And so that is also those 3 values. So I think it's very important to keep all of those in mind when voting, because on the basis of those, all the others will fall, whereas the reverse is not going to happen.
Very good. Thank you. We are just out of time. Wonderful panel. Father Robert Spitzer, Father Mitch Pacwa, of course, Colin Donovan, our VP of Theology, and we leave you with some words of wisdom from our foundress. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, so should you vote? Oh, yes, you should. Doesn't matter who we vote for. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I'm not going to vote for candidates. I vote for life. For life. I vote for life. Because it's an abomination to God, the culture of death. An abomination to God, the culture of death. I cannot vote for death. I vote for life. If we don't stand for the principles of God, you will be next, because you're getting too old. You take up too much time in medicine. Yeah. The culture of death is hard, unbending. It is without love, without compassion, without hope. It's the blackest pit. It's nothing. Nothing but darkness. I cannot vote for that. I cannot vote for that.